Kent Hovind has single-handedly exposed evolutionists for the frauds they are. After years of having their bad science debunked, the evolutionists colluded with the IRS to silence Hovind. As of this video's upload date, he is currently serving a 10-year sentence for tax fraud and facing more charges to keep him there even longer. He is a modern martyr for truth. I will confess that many of the creationist arguments I'm exploring in this series were first presented to me by Hovind. The fact is, he was a very prolific, rapid-fire creation apologist who was sharp-witted and a charismatic speaker. He was completely adept in public presentation. No matter how well-researched they may be, few scientists could match his charisma. As you saw in the first episode, typically I am the first person to discount paranoid conspiracy theories, but I'm always a champion for people who find ways to avoid taxes. And in this case, with all of the motivation to silence Hovind, I knew I had to investigate. Depending on when you asked him, Kent Hovind started creation science evangelism either in 1989 or 1991 to evangelize people by teaching them creationism. As his operation expanded, he began employing students from the nearby Pensacola Christian College. Pensacola Christian College has a very strong anti-tax protester stance. Sometime in the mid-90s, their senior vice president, Rebecca Horton, was given a video by one of Hovind's employees that featured another pastor advocating tax protesting. Miss Horton's response to the woman was, "The day could come when you're going to be in trouble because Mr. Hovind is going to be in trouble." Soon after, the administration placed a call to the IRS and gave the videotape to officials. Students of the college were forbidden from working for Hovind from then on. An IRS investigation determined that Hovind and creation science evangelism had failed to pay or file taxes for at least 3 years. In 1996, Hovind filed for Chapter 13 bankruptcy and claimed that, as a person, not a corporation, and since he revoked his U.S. citizenship, his personal finances did not qualify as income. Hovind was also found to have misrepresented his possessions and finances. He also claimed that all of the money his ministry made belonged to God, so therefore he, personally, was not subject to taxation. His bankruptcy case was immediately dismissed. In May of 1998, Hovind and his wife sought to nullify all of their legal debts and obligations prior to April of that year by claiming they were all the resort of coercion and duress by filing a power of attorney and revocation of signature, which also alleged that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme and therefore illegal, and also referring to the U.S. government as a bankrupt corporate government. Again, they renounced their American citizenship. Unsurprisingly, neither the courts nor the IRS would later take these claims seriously. Compounding their problems, in 2002, Hovind was charged for failing to conform to zoning regulations with his dinosaur Adventureland. Hovind argued that the zoning laws and permit requirements conflicted with his deeply held religious beliefs, therefore being unconstitutional. But the judge disagreed on the basis that zoning regulations exist in the interest of public safety and ordered the building closed until it complied with regulations. Hovind's attorney, Glenn Stoll, publicly declared the decision to be religious persecution. County Commission Chairman Mike Whitehead simply asserted, "Scripture also says render unto Caesar what Caesar demands, and right now, Caesar demands a building permit." During this time, Hovind continued to have taxation issues. The IRS was alerted to Hovind's finances due to his practice of what is called structuring payments. According to federal regulations, any bank deposit or withdrawal made in excess of $10,000 requires the bank to have the customer fill out a form reporting the source or destination of said amount. What isn't commonly known is that bank tellers are also obligated to report when a customer repeatedly makes deposits just under the amount of $10,000. This is a telltale sign of an attempt to avoid reporting. According to the IRS, over a year period, the accumulated withdrawals totaled over $430,000. Hovind responded by filing several harassment suits, claiming that he feared Gestapo actions of the Internal Revenue Service agents against him. In turn, these lawsuits, being called frivolous, were compounded by charges of impeding a federal investigation. In 2004, the IRS raided Hovind's home and businesses, confiscating financial records. Although CSE was legitimately incorporated, it was not licensed to conduct business, nor had it obtained a 501c3 tax-exempt status. Bank records indicated that Hovind had made deposits in excess of $1 million each year. In June of that year, the IRS issued federal liens of over $500,000, which were later upheld by the tax court as valid. By 2006, the IRS began levying against Hovind's property. In July of 2006, Hovind was officially charged with 12 counts of failure to file or pay taxes, 45 counts of structuring payments, and the compounded count of obstruction and impeding the administration of the Internal Revenue laws. Hovind was also charged with falsely listing the IRS as his only creditor and destroying records. Additionally, he was accused of making threats against those who investigated him and anyone who cooperated with investigators, as well as frivolously suing and making false criminal charges against agents. Hovind claimed not to understand the charges against him, ignorance of who was charging him, and that his ministry was not under federal government jurisdiction. When pressed by Judge Miles Davis to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty, Hovind said he was entering a not guilty plea under duress. During the trial, Hovind claimed that CSE had no employees and therefore owed no taxes related to payroll. He considered his employees to be volunteer missionaries whose income wasn't subject to taxation. 8-year employee Brian Popp testified that he preferred to be paid in cash and that Hovind had told him that the other employees felt the same way. He also testified that Hovind had told him about the federal law requiring deposits over $10,000 and that the U.S. government had set up a corporation called Kent Hovind in all caps, charging that accepting any mail addressed to that name would implicate him. Popp was asked to read company memos in court which referred to workers as employees and went further to address definitive aspects of employment such as timeliness, payroll, vacation days, and salaries. 2-year employee Diane Cooksey testified that Hovind was upfront in the interview about his tax stances and that she would have to file her own taxes. As prosecutor Michelle Heldemeyer told reporters, a church still has to pay payroll taxes. IRS investigator M.C. Powell testified that she had been trying to collect taxes from Hovind since 1997, even going so far as to leave a summons with his wife. After Hovind failed to appear per the summons, Powell informed his wife that their vehicles can and will be seized to recoup the taxes owed. Hovind then began to attempt to bully Powell, including 3 civil suits which were all dismissed. Assistant U.S. Attorney Benjamin Beard, who had handled Hovind's bankruptcy, testified that Hovind opted for the Chapter 13 wage earner plan, which is specifically designed for people with a regular source of income. Income is something Hovind claims not to have, and Beard also testified that Hovind rejected his Social Security number. Hovind's defense opted not to present a case, arguing that it was the prosecution's job to show that he knew he was breaking the law. On November 2, 2006, the jury deliberated for a total of 3 hours before finding Hovind guilty on all 58 charges. In jail while awaiting sentencing, and despite written warnings that phone calls are recorded, Hovind ran up an average of 8 hours of calls per week as he discussed plans to hide assets, threaten government officials, and refused to accept responsibility for his crimes. In January of the following year, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison and ordered to pay $600,000 in restitution to the federal government. While in prison, Hovind has filed several appeals and petitions to contest the amount he owed, to challenge his conviction, and to contest his treatment in prison. All of them were denied. He is scheduled for release from prison on August 10, 2015. On October 21, 2014, Hovind was indicted by a federal grand jury in Pensacola, Florida. He faces 2 counts of mail fraud, 1 count of conspiracy to commit mail fraud, and 1 count of criminal contempt. He pled not guilty, and so this story goes on. In going over the details of Hovind's case, I can't count how many times I did the old facepalm. So many things Hovind did brought this upon himself. Although there was no reason to suspect his fellow creationist Rebecca Horton would rat him out to the feds, it was his own stupidity to cavalierly discuss his practice of not paying taxes. It was his own stupidity to structure his bank payments just under $10,000. It was stupid to threaten a government official. It was stupid not to present a case in your defense. And besides all the crazy schemes he used in his defense, it was stupid to file taxes as a wage earner, and it was stupid to discuss it at length over your prison phone. Whether or not there is a conspiracy against Kent Hovind, the major reason he is in prison is his own stupidity. As one article observed, it's hard to believe a man with a PhD didn't know a basic tax law. On the other hand, I credit Kent Hovind with being the catalyst to my ever-increasing passion for science. He taught me to investigate. Investigating his rapid-fire creationist claims on nearly every branch of science has given me an enormously new understanding of what science is and led me to realize realize how little I know. Although this episode has no actual science in it, through my investigations of Kent Hovind's claims, I hope you can see how creationism taught me real science. Learn more about the real science behind other creationist arguments by watching other episodes. If there's a creationist argument you think I should investigate, please comment below. It may be the subject of a later video. In the meantime, subscribe and make sure you don't miss it. When Charles Darwin first proposed his theory of evolution, he had no idea how complex the cell was. At the time, scientists all thought the nucleus of a cell was just a ball of protoplasm. They had no idea that it would contain DNA. Put simply, DNA disproves evolution. If he were alive today, Darwin would probably throw up his hands in frustration. This degree of complexity seems like the final nail in the coffin for evolution. I just had to investigate. When Charles Darwin first published On the Origin of Species in 1859, he proposed two specific theses as mechanisms for evolution. The first was that the struggle for existence limits the ability of individuals to reproduce. Therefore, those who are less fit will tend to reproduce less often than those who are more fit within their lifetimes. The second was the notion that any heritable variation that improves an individual's ability to survive and reproduce will tend to be passed on to the next generation. This is known as natural selection. Between February and March of 1865, Gregor Mendel presented his paper, Experiments on Plant Hybridization, to the Natural History Society of Brno in Moravia. His presentation discussed the selective breeding of specific traits in pea plants and showed that traits are passed on from parents with predictable probabilities. It showed that traits are passed on in full and not blended, as the scientific consensus held. Although the paper was very well received, it was not accepted by the scientific community, so Darwin was never privy to its contents. The majority of the world eventually forgot about Mendel's work. While natural selection was a simple enough concept to understand, Darwin was quite aware of the concept of heredity and realized that the causes behind heredity were still a mystery. He knew that there must be some sort of medium in the cell for inheritance and even guessed where it ought to be located. Not knowing exactly what it might be, he referred to it as a gemule and discussed the topic with a Professor Del Pino in an 1869 article titled Pangenesis in the Scientific Opinion, Volume 2. Darwin stated, "As however a cell is a complex structure with its investing membrane, nucleus, and nucleolus, a gemule must perhaps be a compound one so as to reproduce all the parts." Darwin was obviously aware that whatever was responsible for inherited traits would be very complex. That same year, Friedrich Miescher discovered a microscopic substance in the pus of used bandages which he dubbed nuclein, as it resided in the nucleus of cells. In 1878, Albrecht Kossel isolated nucleic acid and later isolated its primary nucleobases. While Darwin did live to see the discovery of nuclein, which would later be recognized as deoxyribonucleic acid, he died in 1882, before nucleic acid could be shown to be the mechanism of inheritance. At the close of the 18th century, Hugo de Vries and Carl Correns were conducting research aimed at finding a successful theory of discontinuous inheritance rather than the commonly accepted blending inheritance. Both scientists independently duplicated the work of Mendel and then rediscovered Mendel's writings and laws. Both researchers published their work rediscovering Mendel's work within a 2-month span in the spring of 1900. Later that year, evolutionary biologist Thomas Hunt Morgan demonstrated through mutations in Drosophila flies that genes on chromosomes are the mechanical base of heredity. This was essentially the true beginning of the science of genetics. Incidentally, his mutation experiments at his famous fly room were also the beginning of a long scientific tradition of studying evolution using Drosophila flies. In 1927, Nikolai Koltsov, using the concept of evolutionary refinement, proposed that the inherited traits would be contained in a giant hereditary molecule made up of 2 mirror strands that would replicate in a semi-conservative fashion, using each strand as a template. In 1950, 1952, Alfred Hershey and Martha Chase conducted experiments with bacteriophages. Bacteriophages are viruses which primarily infect bacteria. They observed the phages before infecting the host and after. They discovered that the phages were empty of DNA after infecting the host. This demonstrated that DNA was, in fact, the mechanism for inheritance in the phage. This vindicated Darwin's initial concept of a gemule. That same year, James Watson and Francis Crick studied a single X-ray diffraction image labeled as Photo 51 of DNA, and by 1953 suggested to the scientific community that DNA existed in a double helix pattern, which also vindicated Koltsov's work. Previously, back in 1857, Darwin wrote to his friend and colleague Thomas Henry Huxley, "The time will come, I believe, though I shall not live to see it, when we shall have fairly true genealogical trees of each great kingdom of nature." As it happens, evolution and genetics have given us just that. In 1735, creationist Carolus Linnaeus published the first edition of his monumental work, Systema Naturae, in which he introduced Linnaean taxonomy. He had been attempting to discover the biblical kinds, but the work turned out to be a much larger undertaking than he had imagined. Using morphological similarities, he was able to classify organisms according to species. He then noticed similarities amongst separate species and grouped them into genera, then families, then classes, and so on. He even included human beings as a member of the animal kingdom. Over 200 years later, in 1942, Ernst Mayr published his work, Systematics and the Origin of Species. Ernst Mayr's work revolutionized biology by unifying Mendelian genetics, taxonomy, and Darwinian evolution. Mayr changed the definition of the taxon species from the Linnaean definition of morphologically similar organisms to populations of organisms which share the ability to interbreed, excluding all others. Although Darwin and others had previously posited that all living organisms shared a common ancestor, Ernst Mayr was the first to offer an explanation utilizing Mendelian concepts. As gene mapping and gene sequencing became more and more efficient, scientists were able to compare the locations of corresponding genes between species, a technique called sequence alignment. This allowed for the construction of a phylogenetic tree which nearly matched the Linnaean classifications. This technique is currently used by courts when testing to determine relationship among people. It works just as well in determining relationships between species. In 1974, Robert Gallo identified the first human retrovirus. A retrovirus has a very unique mode of reproduction. Instead of merely infecting a cell and forcing it to produce copies of itself, it makes a DNA copy of its own RNA and then inserts it into the DNA of the host cell. If all goes well for the retrovirus, the cell will continue to copy itself and the retroviral sequence along with it. In the case of the HIV virus, it can be latent until a change in the cell environment triggers it and it becomes full-blown AIDS. Occasionally, the cell makes an error in copying the viral DNA sequence, rendering it unable to activate. From there, it is continually passed on each time the cell reproduces and serves as a genetic marker that geneticists can easily recognize. These are known as endogenous retroviruses, and about 4% of the human genome is comprised of them. If evolution is true, related species should share these ERVs in the same locations along the genome if the retrovirus was inserted prior to their speciation. And when examining the genomes of other animals, we see exactly that. For example, we find two ERVs, LTR32 and LTR21Q22.2, in the exact same locations along the genomes of humans, chimps, and gorillas, but not gibbons nor any other known species. Meanwhile, humans, chimps, and gorillas share the LTR21Q22.3 and the LTR41 at the same locations in the genome as gibbons, but no other known species. This pattern continues when we compare the genomes of more and more genetically separate species. When examining the genomes of humans and other great apes, however, we notice a disparity in the number of chromosomes in the genomes. Humans have 23 chromosome pairs, while apes have 24 chromosome pairs. The loss of a complete chromosome in an organism would be deadly. If they share a common ancestor, evolution predicts that the information from that chromosome must be located somewhere in the human genome. The most likely scenario, keeping with evolutionary predictions, is the fusion of two chromosomes into one. In October of 1991, Dr. Jacob Ito published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that his research team had found that fusion. A single chromosome comprises between 3 and 5% of the total DNA in great apes, but in humans, chromosome 2 comprises 8%. Ito's team began there and found some dead giveaways of chromosomal fusion. A typical chromosome will have telomeres on both ends which serve to protect the chromosome from from deterioration. In the center is a similar structure known as a centromere. Ito's research team discovered that human chromosome number 2 had 2 telomeres on either side and 2 vestigial telomeres at its center. They also found 2 centromeres, one active and the other inactive. Further examination showed that the genes located on human chromosome number 2 corresponded to virtually identical genes located on 2 separate genes in chimps, gorillas, and orangutans. In the end, Darwin did predict a complex mechanism for inheritance to be located in the cell. He also proposed that the mechanism would be located in the nucleus. Once the DNA mechanism and its behaviors were understood, Darwin's theory predicted even more about DNA, even the ability to trace the relationship of all living organisms on the planet. And that's the major strength of a theory. It isn't just a proposition. It isn't just a guess. It's an explanation that predicts the evidence. When those predictions fail to match nature, the theory is revised. The result is that theories become stronger and stronger as their predictions are tested, and few theories have been tested as brutally and as thoroughly as the theory of evolution. And that's another example of how creationism taught me real science.
Learn more about the real science behind other creationist arguments by watching other episodes. If there's a creationist argument you think I should investigate, please comment below. It may be the subject of a later video. In the meantime, subscribe and make sure you don't miss it.